John deVadoss, my co-founder of NeuralFabric. But first, a very big thank you to Sandra, to the team here for setting it up, and also our colleagues here in this building for helping us to make this session happen. So let me talk to you about AI a little bit, and you're wondering why AI in a GBBC session. And very shortly, I think you have a very good picture of why I'm talking about AI today. But firstly, about NeuralFabric, we're a Seattle-based startup. We have customers, including both startups as well as Fortune 500 companies, building models using the platform that we are building for them. So let me start. I guess, yeah, there we go. Oh, that's a long bio if you care about it, but. So AI today, I would say, is a bit like the internet back in the late 80s. Latent potential, significant academic research, massive academic work going on, but the fast turnaround, unlike back in the late 80s, early 90s, is significantly escalated right now. We see research papers going into production in a matter of weeks, and we see technology becoming obsolete in a matter of months. Right? This is something we got to think about a little bit. I'll tell you why very shortly, why this is important. Significant potential, but is it ready? That's the question I want to ask. I want to challenge you to think about it, as you go back to your work. So first, in terms of what is going on in the AI space, I'll give you a very, very brief story. So up until, I would say, a few years ago, much of what is called machine learning, what is called AI, used models to be able to classify and to predict. So classical machine learning was mostly about classification and prediction. And maybe you all know this. But Gen AI, the current incarnation of AI, uses models to be able to extrapolate. If you're a math person, basically, think of it as regression on sequences. It's doing regression to be able to predict, extrapolate. Or naively, you could say, Gen AI basically fills in the blanks. And the blanks could be very small, like small chunks of code. It could be very big blanks, as in, write me a paper on geography 60 years ago. So very small fill in the blanks or very large fill in the blanks, right? And so these models that we use today to be able to power Gen AI, they're called foundation models. And there's a variety of them. I won't name them in this session. There's a variety of these foundation models. The first thing is I want to share with you, as we take these models apart, as we go back to the first principles, what we see is these foundation models are trained on anything and everything they can find. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Stuff across the web, the dark web, you name it. If they can source it, it's being trained and ingested. And this has significant implications, as you can imagine, because the foundations themselves, what this means is when you have vendors building these models, for example, again, I won't name names, but a certain very large vendor who you all know uses offshore firms to do classification and labeling of data. And this offshore location is based in an area that's not necessarily very friendly to our country. So you can imagine the implications of Trojan horses and data sets, of worms and viruses, right? So my first point is these foundation models are flawed. It doesn't mean we throw them all away. No, it means we have to think very carefully about how we train and build these models. Second, open is not open. You might hear the term about open models, open source, but just because we're able to see a window into the model does not make it open. For example, if you say, look, we share with you the weights or perhaps the parameters. In the world of scientific research, to be able to replicate the work is the litmus test. And so you really cannot replicate these foundation models because you don't have the data or the log or the ledger to be able to replicate the results. And so open is not really open right now, unfortunately, very regretfully. These black boxes, so when we think of them as open, we can say, look, we can probably build some threat models or attack vectors. But if they are not really open, you have no idea what the surface area looks like to be able to even attempt to build these threat models. It's a fundamental issue. The third piece here. So when I built my company back in September of last year, my thesis was, look, I could use these so-called open public models, fine-tune them on corporate data, and give it to my customers. And when I realized these so-called public models are flawed and tainted, I would say tainted, possibly even radioactive, then it occurred to me that I could not, with a clear conscience, say, I will train this model with your data and give it to you to use, because I cannot predict what the responses will be depending on the prompts coming in. Make sense? Right? So, key point here is the foundations of this approach are a little bit shaky, and as you can imagine very quickly right now, why blockchains come in, because we need to be able to have logs, cryptographically secure ledgers of the data coming into the model. My second slide. So privacy implications, security implications. So firstly, privacy. Prompts. I'm sure many of you have used GPT-like apps, or you know people who've used them, right? So think of the prompts as IP. So why are the prompts IP? Because you're essentially deliberating, creating or co-creating with the service, with the application. You're trying out various prompts. Whether you're building a model for ESG, or you're writing a white paper on perhaps crypto in the 21st century, you are co-creating. So your prompts, including your primitive prompts, as you elaborate on them, they're truly your IP, as an individual, but also as an organization. On the other side, discussing earlier this afternoon, so prompts also potentially create other issues in terms of liability. For example, if you have an employee who says, look, I asked this question, and the model gave me this response which is inappropriate, how do you go back and ensure or even check or verify if that's what happened, unless you can treat the prompts as IP and log them? Make sense so far? So today, for the most part, we kind of just throw away prompts, which is to me very, very slippery slope in terms of, again, IP, but also liability, et cetera, et cetera. Thirdly, in terms of safety. Now, obviously, as you know, if you think of this as co-creation, whether it's a public model or a private model, we have to really think very carefully about logging the responses as well as the requests in terms of IP, in terms of copy, et cetera, et cetera. You know this space very clearly, right? And also lastly, in terms of, I don't want to say too much, but think of this as Easter eggs, right? Easter eggs can be funny, can be okay. We can deal with Easter eggs. But as you move beyond the spectrum of Easter eggs to Trojan horses, to be able to potentially deal with embeddings that can be passed on into the new content, then you have a situation where you got to be very, very cautious if you're an organization in terms of, again, liability, etc. So I will very quickly sort of close off and say, I believe it's a very interesting point in terms of the evolution of AI, where we as blockchain proponents have to be able to step up and say, guys, look, these models need manifests. We have to have a log, a ledger. This has to be replicable, repeatable, first and foremost. And so this means, obviously, we know the story, transparency, immutability, right? We know where this leads. So I believe this essentially provides significant opportunity for us all in the GBBC and beyond to be able to take a hard look and say, yes, potential, but how do we harness this? Lastly, I want to say, I believe, this is an opinion, so take it for what it's worth, right? That there is an imperative to build what I call sovereign models. Sovereign at the state level, I believe certainly, because you can imagine the implications and the risks, obviously, in terms of these models. There's a reason why we have certain nations in the world who have essentially barred the use of these public open services. I won't name any names, but you can find out. There's a reason why we have large actors investing significantly in building these models for others to use. I believe we have to really take a hard look and say, what does it mean to build sovereign models? But also, if you're a private organization, I think now is the time to say, okay, what kind of models do you want to deploy and use within the organization? So when I say sovereign, I mean both in terms of the state as well as in terms of the organization, right? And last but not the least, in terms of all the interaction, we have to think very carefully and say, look, are we logging in a ledger the prompts coming in? Are we logging in a blockchain the prompts going out? And do we have the chain? Because in this case, what is often missing is to be able to secure data in motion. It's not just at rest, it's in motion. And so things like roll-ups become very interesting all of a sudden. Being able to say, how do we address this need to be able to secure data in motion, beyond obviously all the well-known, right? And last but not the least, I would say, as you look to use this, think about the attack surface area, think about the threat vectors, and certainly think about logging, in a very immutable, obviously secure ledger of your choice. It doesn't matter what it is, but I think we're going to see this next wave of AI really built on a foundation of ledgers and blockchains. So with that, I want to just quickly stop. And any quick questions before we break for dinner? If not, I guess I won't. Yes, sir.
Do you see the utilization of crypto as a trust mechanism, through microtransactions, specific to the ledger, whether it's for verifying the copyright or paying somebody?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really good question in terms of using, as incentive mechanisms to be able to drive the governance security, but also in terms of the IP itself. I see IP marketplaces being driven by this because data sets become paramount, and especially clean data sets become, are worth their weight in gold. Yeah, absolutely.
You're aware of any projects that are using crypto right now for that purpose?
Not that I know of. I've had discussions with people that are looking to use it. I'm not doing it, but certainly there are people who I've talked to about using, so yes. One more question? Yes, sir.
I don't like to admit this, but I'm originally from insurance, so as I was getting into crypto, they were starting to talk about blockchain for provenance tracing and things like that. I don't think it's made a lot of progress.
No.
But when I think about the scale of the data, the name of the game is compression. Is it feasible in any way, shape, or form, from what you see today, to actually commit logs on both sides to a blockchain that is remotely cost-effective, compressible, and how far away are we from something like that? If there was the will.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I believe in terms of the prompts, yes, absolutely. In terms of the data sets, I think we have to be very creative in terms of signing those data sets or having these maybe open markets for these signed data sets to be able to consume them. Else, you're right, as a one-off can be a very expensive hit to the organization. Which is why I believe there's a need for these sovereign models, to be able to have maybe state or multi-state organizations to be able to invest to create this. But you're right, in terms of a single organization, I think the expenses could be very severe, very significant, unless, of course, you're big. Hopefully this gives you some food for thought. No solutions, but I believe this gives you an idea in terms of where the opportunity lies for blockchain significantly, in terms of governance, in terms of security, but also in terms of incentive models to be able to enable the creation and the development of these. One last thing, so we are a pioneer in what we call micro-foundation models. Some people think of AI as being really this intelligence, this sort of, superhuman, and I will tell you, I did my PhD work in AI back in the 90s, long before AI was cool, and nobody cared about the AI at that time. And I'll tell you, so I think of AI as a tool, not as a superhuman entity. We don't even know how our intelligence works, let alone to be able to ascribe human-level quality to a system. So what I want to say is, as a tool, there is a very, very interesting quote which says, look, we better shape our tools, else our tools will shape us. right? So I want to leave you with that quote about, let's make sure that we shape these tools, otherwise they're going to end up shaping us, and we might not like how that goes. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and have a good evening. Thank you.